Welcome to this recorded presentation on chasing opportunities with the Washington State Energy Code. In this series of presentations, we'll dive into some techniques for meeting and exceeding code with various options from Table 406.3 in the 2018 Washington State Energy Code. This particular session will focus on envelope options for the home. Other modules include building tight and ventilating right, as well as HVAC system and duct locations. If we're ready, let's get going. Without a doubt, code change can be challenging, but we can also choose to look at the opportunity to look at the benefits of code change. So we're first going to start off with thinking about what are some of the benefits that come with the energy code changes, and let's think about them from each of these different stakeholder perspectives. To you, the builder, to home energy raters, to your subcontractors and trade allies, and to the homeowners. In specific, let's think about the benefit to the homeowners. The price of energy and construction are always changing. They generally trend up and stay level for long stretches. Let's face it, the cost to build a home rarely goes down. We can look at the value of happy homeowners, making it easier to meet future codes, improving homeowners' lending power with lower bills and maintenance versus slightly higher purchasing prices. And when we do this, we can really start to paint a picture of are there benefits we can take advantage of? And again, look at code change as an opportunity, not just a challenge. When faced with the new code, we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to take the high road or the low road? The low road meaning the lowest first cost option to simply meet the code. The high road is looking at moving beyond the current code. You can almost think of it as future-proofing your home against the next code. In order to do that, we have to ask ourselves some questions. Can we see what the benefits are, not just today, but tomorrow? What are the benefits down the road for taking the high road? But we also have to balance that with, can we estimate tomorrow's challenges today? If we just take a first glance at it, of course, the low road seems like an easier path. And of course, doing this at the most cost competitive way is very desirable. But if we don't yet know where we're headed, we may not be aware that the low road may have some blockages in front of it and may have some limitations. In other words, we may have to redo this all over again in 2, 3, or 4 years to rethink this. Whereas taking a high road may put us in a different position to stay beneficial above this. So what are some of the benefits if we ask ourselves about going the high road? Well, possibly there could be an enhanced valuation of the home. There is the green appraisal addendum that's currently available to the market that allows you to take some credit with the valuation of the home for some of the green or higher performance things that are added. There's some value associated with brands and labels. You can look at the Energy Star label, the Built Green label, the Earth Advantage label, the National Green Building Standard label, and LEED for Homes, and many others that are out there. And each of them may have some purchase power or some advantage and differentiation into the market. Most of the programs that we just mentioned have built-in quality assurance and quality control. So if part of what your mechanism is for selling your homes is benchmarking yourself on quality and selling that to your homeowners, isn't taking advantage of programs with built-in quality assurance and quality control a good idea? Again, future-proofing for a code. Let's make sure that when someone does resell this house, and say 7 years is about the average amount of time people spend in a home, wouldn't it be great if that home, when it goes on the market, is actually competitive with the next iteration of code homes? And then we can also look for, do some of the new measures that come along with code or going above code give us some sales opportunities? And we'll talk a lot more about each of these as we go forward. I just want to briefly talk a little bit more about these additional benefits. So product differentiation, right? We're in a market where there's a lot that's available out there. If we think of the grocery store analogy, like the image you see here, part of product differentiation might be the coloring and the packaging. It could be positioning on the shelves. And we can think of it as a similar mechanism here. Can we put product differentiation for the home that you sell? Selling a home that's known to have good indoor air quality, or at least a reduced risk of bad indoor air quality, in today's market is a great way to differentiate your homes, as a for instance. We can also look, again, I mentioned earlier the quality angle. Who is the most trusted in the eyes of the home buyer? Raters and energy consultants can improve their businesses, if you're one of them, by becoming a recognized trade and working with the builder. So building that trust, helping the builder to deliver on a better home and a home that can be sold for more, is a really great benefit. And then we've got homeowner benefits that are beginning to become monetized. So the example that's here is the Energy Spark home loan. This actually gives advantageous lending rates to homes that meet above code programs. So we really are starting to see the benefits fall in a lot of different ways. So again, moving beyond code, there are these benefits, many of which we just talked about already. But we don't want to just sugarcoat this. We do have to recognize that along with this, you can't just say that there are benefits. We really have to take some things into account. So, let's look at some of these. Return on investment perhaps is the single greatest way to benchmark whether or not these benefits are worth it. So you have to ask yourself, can I sell this new home for both the cost and my margin I need to make? So if I decide to go above code, going above the level of my competition, can I sell that product? And can this lead to referrals? Can this really give me a way to differentiate my project? And could maybe this appeal to a larger audience of buyers? Moving above code is not just about receiving incentives from a utility program or a federal tax credit, all of which are valuable. It really is trying to say, we have these benefits here, but let's put them in a context and really ask ourselves, is it worth it from a return on investment perspective? If we're going to talk about the benefits, we have to be fair and also then talk about some of the challenges that come with this. So let's think about this from this context. If we look at the cost versus time, every time code changes, we feel a pain point, right? Our cost is going up almost overnight, right? The code changes on a certain date. From that moment forward, we have to now build to a new standard. And it happens depending on the state you're in, but Washington State, for instance here, approximately every 3 years, we go through this process. So the challenges may be a little different, but they seem to be recurring on a pretty regular basis. And that is very fair to assess that. And it's okay to be challenged with the challenges, to look at this and say, this is hard for us to manage. But I'm going to propose that going above code may be one way to reduce the number of pain points that you're going to have to face when considering challenges. So what do I really mean when I say reduce all the challenges or all the pain points when we look at this, right? Well, of course, the first time a code is going to be changing, there is still a pain point. But if we were to shoot above code for that first time, maybe even estimating what the next round of code might look like, we encourage the pain point, we shoot, since we're already shooting, we're already making changes, we're already investing in our product. If we shoot forward, we put ourselves in that opportunity zone. This is where product differentiation can happen. Exposure and outreach to a larger market can happen. Potentially looking at valuation and monetization of these benefits for consumers. And finally, maybe buying down some of those costs with things like federal tax credits and utility incentives, all of which can place a large value. So there are some really good benefits of using a basic business case process for thinking about code change. Now, we've talked about this a fair amount. I don't want to belabor it. We're going to jump right in now to the rest of the content, but I did want to set this up because we really do believe that thinking this through like you would any business case by building the list of challenges and the list of benefits, monetizing those that you can, and recognizing what benefits are actually achievable by you, and then how does that turn into a return on investment? If you can spend time in the opportunity zone and the return on investment is positive, then code change can be an opportunity, not just a pain point. So just to wrap this up, we have to ask ourselves, what are the benefits of going above code? We just listed them. You probably have some of your own. You're scratching down as you're watching this. What would the benefits be of moving above code for your company and the product that you sell? Think of it more specifically, not just a generic going above code, but for your construction practice. If you're a home energy rater, for your consulting practice, what are those benefits of moving above code for your company? And then how would you use this business case process and make it beneficial for you? Can you actually do this where you can monetize and look at a return on investment where you have a balanced equation between challenges and benefits and recognize when you can monetize challenges and when you can monetize benefits? If you can do all of this, you got it. You are ready for us, and I'll dive into some specifics. Within section and table 406.3 of the 2018 Washington State Energy Code, there are opportunities to get credits from various different topic areas. Today we're talking about efficient building envelopes. While it's not explicitly required that you get some points from every category, it is most likely going to be the case that you'll need to get some points from most categories. So what you're looking at right now is the list of potential credits available and the options that align with them. We're going to jump in just a minute to some of the most popular and some of the most desirable options and associated credits. Currently, the most popular credit in this category is a half credit for option 1.3. This could be prescriptively doing the prescriptive section of the Washington State Energy Code, plus having U-value 0.28 or lower windows, plus an R38 floor or R10 under slab insulation. You could also achieve this by getting a 5% overall UA reduction in your envelope. That can be done through the UA trade-off calculator available on the Washington State University Energy Extension Program's website. So take a look there if you're concerned about UA trade-offs. Some of the more desirable measures or options here are 1.4 and 1.5, and that is because they are worth 1 and 2 credits respectively. Option 1.4, you could do either prescriptively by doing the prescriptive components of the code, plus 0.28 windows, plus your R21 standard wall with R4 of continuous insulation, plus an R38 floor or an R10 under the slab. This is equivalent to a 15% UA reduction. The next level, worth 2 full credits, again is the prescriptive requirements in the code, plus 0.22 windows, plus an R49 attic, plus R21 in the walls, and R12 of continuous insulation, plus that R38 floor or R10 slab. This is equivalent to a 30% UA reduction. By the way, if you could do a little bit more, like let's say R60 in the lid and 0.24 windows and maybe a double wall and R38 floors, you might likely get a similar answer that you would get from the traditional option of 1.5. So using a UA reduction calculator, such as the one provided by Washington State University Energy Program, might be a nice alternative to this prescriptive approach. In order to get either the 1 or 2 full credits from the building envelope, again, we're looking at options 1.4 and 1.5 as real potential. In order to get there, we're going to look at 3 different wall types that are either currently fairly common or potentially newly common that are really good opportunities. And these 3 wall types are the thermal break shear wall, also the extended plate and beam variation of it, intermediate framing with exterior rigid insulation, or a double stud or staggered wall option. We're going to look at each of these individually, and we're going to reference some available reports for those of you who would like to dive much deeper and get really specific. So with that, let's take a look at each of these different wall types and look at some of the pros and cons, the opportunities and challenges, and the things that we really need to know to pull this off. Of these 3 wall types, the thermal break shear wall and the intermediate framing with exterior rigid insulation are both good mechanisms to help you achieve that envelope option 1.4. It really comes down to that R4 continuous insulation that's necessary. We're going to take a much deeper dive into this, and we're going to use some NEA reports on advanced walls, as well as some supplemental information we have from the Home Innovation Research Labs and the Department of Energy. Don't worry, we'll provide links for all of the reports that we're going to quote as we go through. For those considering going for envelope option 1.5, worth the full 2 credits, we're really looking at either double stud or staggered stud walls, or maybe something like an exterior rigid insulation with much more than a single inch of insulation. But we're going to focus on the double walls and staggered studs today. I mentioned earlier some of the reports that we're going to be quoting. Each of these are live links, so on Better Built Northwest, you'll be able to download the PDF of this presentation, and each of these links will be live. So NEA had 2 different phases of their reports on advanced walls generated, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is your basic overview. Phase 2 goes into some more in-depth and particularly looking at things like moisture migration in walls, etc. We also have a link to the DOE's Extended Plate and Beam report done in conjunction with Home Innovation Research Lab. Each of these are terrific resources in their own right, but we're going to try and cover at least some of that today in this module, and then you've got the option to dive deeper on your own. Let's start by looking at the thermal break shear wall, right? We also sometimes refer to this as the Martha Wall up in Seattle, Washington, because Martha Rose actually pioneered this a great number of years ago. There's actually another approach to this in other parts of the country where they have an extended plate and beam, which we're going to cover in a different slide. As you can see here, we get some benefit obviously from having continuous insulation. Another major factor is that you have got the exterior surface for nailing and penetrations that trades are much more familiar with compared to exposed foam and mineral wool board. Effectively, we're moving the insulation between the studs and the exterior sheathing, as opposed to having the insulation on the full exterior. Now, there could be some challenges in some places with this, with code, in terms of code acceptance. This doesn't look like all the other walls, and authorities having jurisdiction may have issues with it initially. But there's good news. We have several case studies that can be shared that have documented how this approach was approved in a few jurisdictions already. We've already helped a jurisdiction accept this wall by sharing these case studies in Southern Oregon, so we know it's a valid way to approach this. Moisture management is another potential challenge. Turns out that the right foam needs to be selected, and most likely you'd still want a rain screen or draining house wrap on the exterior of this wall to reduce any chances of moisture issues. That is a lot more in depth in the phase 2 of the NEA report that's available to you. Costs are something that are often brought up here. Additional incremental costs at first is likely to be around $1.40 a square foot. But if built on enough homes, the economies of scale may bring the incremental cost down to as low as 48 cents a square foot. One reason the cost here is going to show up lower than for, say, continuous insulation on the exterior is that the installers can attach the foam to the sheathing quickly while it's on the ground and then tip it up in one piece to be secured to the studs. For continuous insulation on the exterior, those are 2 different steps to be taken into account, and it impacts the labor time for install. One big key consideration here is on a comparative scale, this wall type is relatively easy to install. It reduces thermal bridging. It's structurally stronger than a typical wall. It may reduce sound transmission, but it does need to be installed correctly and have some protection against moisture issues considered. I mentioned earlier that there's another version of this that nationally is being used quite regularly, and that is called the extended plate and beam variation. In this, basically everything is the same as the thermal break shear wall, but if you'll notice the images on the left half of the screen in particular, you can see at the very top of the wall and at the bottom of the section of wall where it intersects with between floors, we actually have a wider plate than the studs are. So we may, for instance, have a 2x8 plate on the top and the bottom, while our studs and framing members are 2x6. This allows us that additional 1.75 inches almost to put foam in, and then our OSB or plywood or external sheathing has a nailing surface at the top and the bottom that is not going directly through the foam. So again, this eliminates some of those concerns that a structural code official may have, and it makes it a little bit easier to do your tie downs between floors with walls on the extended plate and beam variation. It does have a slight reduction in overall U value because you have a little bit more wood, but overall the gains are quite worth it. And again, something that's been done regularly in other parts of the country. So we're pretty confident that this can work in the Northwest as well. So what's the performance of a thermal break shear wall look like? In this particular case, I've got R4.2 of continuous insulation being installed, again, between the exterior sheathing and the studs. Now, this is my own spreadsheet that I developed along with some friends at the WSU Energy Program, 13 to 15 years ago now. And the math is pretty solid. But my numbers may differ a little bit from the way framing fractions are used by code officials and by the references in the energy code. So we do recommend don't use a personal spreadsheet for this. Use that UA trade-off calculator or another approved tool such as ResCheck or REM Design to actually get an average U value. But you can take a look at this and see the overall effective R value of this wall with R21 in the cavity and continuous R4.2 between the sheathing and the studs is an effective R value of about 23.4. That's a really pretty terrific wall and one that might be hard to get any other way. Now you could get a similar performance by doing a dense pack in your cavity insulation and getting, say, an R23.5 within the framing and then going with an R3 on your continuous. Going to get you a very similar number. So consider that, use your UA trade-off calculators to be able to show that this is equivalent, but I just wanted to indicate that the performance is pretty darn good. A little bit later, we're going to show performance of this wall compared to continuous insulation, and you'll note that the effective R value should be pretty darn similar between the two. I mentioned that there have been or could be some particular code adoption issues, as this thermal break shear wall doesn't look like a lot of other walls that most code officials are familiar with. And I referenced that we have some case studies available. Well, here's an example of a case study. There are at least two on the buildinginnovations.org website. And the link is actually live at the bottom there, buildinginnovations.org, case studies, and then case studies on the building envelope. This one is for the Martha Wall, done in Seattle. We also have another one done in Portland, Oregon. So we have multiple code jurisdictions that have shown approval for this wall system type. And being able to utilize these case studies in your own authority having jurisdiction territory is a great way to ensure that all the knowledge gets transferred to the people that need to see it in order to get a wall like this approved to be used. So now we're moving to the more traditional exterior rigid insulation application. We still get some benefit from having this continuous insulation again. With this approach, however, siders, window installers, and trim folk will need the proper training and potentially some different flashing and sealing materials in order to get this right. Because now we're applying siding, rain screens, windows, and sealing around penetrations directly against foam as compared to against the sheathing, which you would do for a thermal break shear wall. So it is a little different. This has been done around the country for a number of years and is pretty well accepted as the standard way to get more insulation in an average wall type. Some of the challenges with this, selecting the correct rigid insulation is still a real part of this. We still need to make sure that the moisture issues do not develop, as well as making sure we integrate the product into the rest of the wall with critical design decisions. Again, training for siding and trades that work on the exterior is almost certainly going to be necessary. The reports we are referencing and tools such as Construction Instruction have a lot more details on integrating that weather-resistant barrier materials with the existing foams. We can think about cost again. There is an added incremental cost to this, and it's likely to be somewhere between $2.50 to $4.50 per square foot, depending on whether a single layer or two layers of foam were used. If built on enough homes, however, the economies of scale could bring this incremental cost down to somewhere between $1.03 to $2.34 a square foot. Again, why is this cost a little bit higher than the thermal break shear wall cost? For two reasons. One, it is a second step to have to install the foam on top of the sheathing, as opposed to with the thermal break shear wall, the foam is attached to the sheathing while it's down and then it's tipped up all at once. In this scenario, they're put in two separate steps. Second, some of the training and integration of windows, flashings, siding, rain screens, etc., onto the foam does require a little bit different attention to detail and may require some additional training. So there can be some slightly additional costs here. On a comparative scale, this type of wall, again, reduces thermal bridging, may actually reduce sound transmission, usually improves your moisture chances, and again, training of key trades will likely be necessary. If you're looking at things like carbon reduction scores, making decisions on the type of rigid insulation will also have a huge impact. I mentioned that integrating windows, siding, and etc. into this rigid foam exterior can provide a challenge. And it's quite often brought up as one of the biggest problems that trades have with this. Well, there's a few different approaches to this. The first is you could build out window boxes to account for the coming rigid insulation. So the picture in the lower left-hand side of the screen here has wood boxes that extend out from the sheathing a little bit, almost exactly to the same thickness that the rigid insulation will be. This will allow for more of a flush scenario and allow you to have a good nailer for your trim. The second option is using a product such as thermal buck. This is an insulated material with some structural ability and helps with integration without giving up too much R value. So on the middle side picture in the upper right-hand corner are pictures of this thermal buck. Again, an insulated product with some structural stability, allows you to nail your windows directly into it, provides a pretty neat way to do integration, but it is a specific product and there are a couple of brands out there that provide it. Very much so worth considering if you're getting a little bit of pushback from some of your siding and window trades. Taking a look at the performance again on calculating the effective R value, as I hinted earlier, this is about the exact same as the thermal break shear wall. The real difference there is the sequencing and how you put it together. The total R value has the same amount of insulation in the wall cavity and has approximately the same amount of insulation in this example, whether that is on the inside or the outside of the sheathing. So the performance will actually be the same in terms of R value. The change in performance could be in moisture management. So that is something to consider, and I encourage you to read the NEA Phase 2 report if you want to really learn a lot more about this. Or have your home energy rater do that research and work with your siding team, your window team, and your insulation team to ensure that all those considerations have been met. Of note, it may be a little different in Eastern Washington than it is in Western Washington, because things such as average rainfall, so bulk water challenges are different in the two, and then the temperature drive, how cold it is outside compared to how warm it is inside, is much greater in some of the colder parts of the state. So some of that moisture migration and some of the drivers for moisture to move through the walls are different. So it is worth paying special attention to things such as moisture based on your weather and climate profiles. Now, for those that, again, were really looking to improve their envelope and go for that option 1.5 with the 2 credit, the most likely scenario is looking at something like a double stud wall. So here we have a double stud wall. Again, a staggered stud wall could also work. We'll show some images of that. We get some benefit here because we have some continuous insulation. Now, it's not as visible, but if you imagine and look closely at these pictures, especially look at the lower right-hand one, you'll notice that the 2 sets of stud walls, the studs don't actually touch. We typically leave anywhere from a ½ to an 1.5 inch gap between those studs. So that cuts out thermal bridging all the way through and allows some insulation to fill in between there. So effectively, you do have continuous insulation there. You will likely need to put some blocking in occasionally. It might be every 5 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. Learn what your local jurisdiction requires for fire blocking. And that's just to make sure that you don't have a raceway between the 2 stud walls for flame and smoke to move through. But that's a relatively low impact if you use something like OSB as your fire block in that scenario. There's some additional interesting things that people have found in field studies with this work is that with this deeper wall, yes, there could be some challenges with, do I have to change the way I do window flashing and to change the way I look? But we've actually found builders are able to sell this deeper windowsill almost as an extra piece of storage or a place to sit and read a book or enjoy the sunlight or look at a deer outside. So it's an interesting thing that what can be perceived sometimes as an optical challenge can be turned around into something that can be sold. Some of the challenges here, again, we have to maybe give up some sellable floor space if we move that second wall on the interior. And that's real. We want to recognize that. If you're going for a wall that is 15 to 40% lower UA than a traditional wall, however, this approach may still be your best bet, particularly if you wanted to combine it with, say, triple pane windows. On the cost front, there's some additional incremental costs likely associated with this, and it's somewhere around $2 a square foot. And if built on enough homes, the economies of scale might bring this down to 79 cents or 80 cents a square foot. Now, why is that less than what we quoted earlier? Well, it's traditional framing, and one of the interesting things is only one of those two framed walls needs to be your structural framing. The other one is simply in place to provide a nailer for the drywall, for instance, if it's on the interior, a place to run wiring through, and definitely a place to hold more insulation. So this can actually be built fairly quickly with two different sets of walls, again with that 1/2 inch to 1.5 inch gap between them, if done correctly. And we actually find that this cost can be a little bit less incremental. Now you will pay a little bit more for insulation, of course, because you're putting a lot more insulation in it. What we've got here are some more up close pictures of this double stud wall, so you can see that gap in between the two walls in the real world. And you can see that in these cases, the exterior wall, exterior 2x4 wall is the one that's being used structurally. The interior wall is the one that will run plumbing and electrical through it. But in general, you'll have a much deeper area to hold a lot more insulation. So what's the performance of this wall like? If you remember before, we had something like close to an R23 or R24 average R value for an R4 continuous insulation being added through either the thermal break shear wall or continuous insulation on the exterior. Look at the effective R value now, however, with a double wall. I only put R25 in as our continuous insulation here, or our cavity insulation, and R4 continuous between the two sets of studs. But the fact that we don't have any thermal conductance all the way through the building from studs really allows for a much better, what we refer to as framing fraction. And you add all this benefit together and you have an effective R value of over R36. That is a huge leap forward. And again, for those really looking to improve the overall envelope option, combining this with a low U value window, something of 0.24 and lower, that could be a double pane with multiple low E glazings, or it could be triple pane windows, for instance. You can really get terrific thermal performance, and you may have additional cost benefits to your building by doing this. When you have an envelope that is this good, the overall heating load and cooling load for the building goes down enough that you may be able to go a full size smaller on your furnace or heat pump or air conditioner that's installed in your building. So it's something to consider. There are cascading costs that can be associated with each of these, and it's important that we think all of these things through. This is why taking a holistic approach to all of your code credits are really important, and it's why it's critical to do energy modeling and manual J, D, S, and T on your heating system sizing to take this into account and reap those additional benefits. So here I'm comparing our double wall on the left to a continuous insulation of R12. If you remember, that was one of the options prescriptively, right? The R21 wall with R12 insulation on the exterior to get to 1.5. Let's look at the effective R value between these two. So right here I'm showing that, first of all, it's a double wall versus an intermediate framed wall. R4 continuous through the double wall, because again, I'm only assuming about an inch gap in between the two walls, compared to R12 continuous on the other side. But now look at the effective R value down at the bottom. R36.9 for the double wall and R33 for the intermediate framed R21 wall with R12. And actually I put R23 in that intermediate framing just to make it a little bit better. So this double wall, not only may it come in slightly lower cost per square foot, may have some additional benefits such as that deeper window sill that could be sold as an additional benefit, it actually is likely going to outperform your intermediate framed wall with blown-in insulation in R12 continuous. There are other ways to evaluate performance beyond just the R value. So let's take a look at some of the summaries of wall benefits for these three different wall types. For each of these, if you see an F and a D, that is not grading like your high school report card. In this case, D means documented through research, and F means that we have field evidence of it. So let's look at each of these. We can see field evidence that these can be done pretty easily once you've gotten over the initial training component. So let's not kid ourselves. The thermal break shear wall is probably the easiest out the gate. But each of these, with done to scale, can be pretty easily done correctly. Aesthetic benefits, again, because of those deeper sills, which are a sellable component, we actually have some field evidence that double stud walls can provide an aesthetic benefit. All three walls have less thermal bridging, which is terrific. The thermal break shear wall, believe it or not, has increased seismic resiliency. That may sound odd to you, but if you imagine the sheathing being attached on top of the continuous insulation through to the studs, the fact that you're using longer nails or screws actually provides greater flexibility in seismic scenarios. So we have documented research that the thermal break shear wall actually has some seismic resiliency. All three wall types, because you're adding more insulation, will have noise attenuation. All of them, if the correct products are chosen, can have reduced moisture management concerns. And then if we look at just the incremental cost, if done at scale, right, the economies of scale of doing this on many homes, all of these are actually reasonable in terms of additional incremental cost, but we can really look and say the thermal break shear wall has the potential to be the lowest cost up, whereas a double stud wall may actually come in less than continuous insulation on the exterior. So thinking this through, doing a business case for and return on investment for your homes, looking at the additional incremental cost versus the additional benefits, each of these tells a slightly different story. Each of them are great walls, but we again encourage a holistic thought process on what am I actually talking about when I say high performance in terms of my walls and my buildings. So a little bit more on performance. I had mentioned that these all can perform pretty well in a moisture management scenario. And so this is a WSEC analysis, and we're looking here at, the I-5 corridor effectively. Southwest Washington is the example that's being chosen here. And what we actually see is that both the thermal break shear wall and the 2x6 wall with rigid insulation on the exterior both outperformed a conventional 2x6 wall in terms of moisture management. And by that we mean, what was the moisture content of the exterior sheathing? Was it high, and for how long? If you see the dotted horizontal red line, that is kind of your threshold that you want to make sure you don't spend a lot of time above. And you'll notice it is cyclical based on wetting and drying potential, but you'll notice that all three walls can outperform a standard wall as we look at this. In the double wall with blown-in fibrous insulation without a rain screen, it actually performs about the exact same as the conventional 2x6 wall. So again, even without rain screens, all three walls performed as well or better in a WSEC analysis as did a conventional wall. Now again, this may require you picking the correct rigid insulation in the two instances with that scenario, and it probably is using blown fiberglass more than likely for the double wall. But all three can perform quite well. Now we're looking at the same performance in Eastern Washington. So in this particular case, we were looking at Spokane. The double stud wall, both with and without a rain screen, perform at levels similar to the conventional wall. As a matter of fact, the conventional wall and those all have potential to have over-wetting of that exterior OSB for short periods of time. And it's a little bit higher the first season, right? So that is the building's drying out process. There's some better built-in moisture. Over time, however, they will all perform quite well. The thermal break, the conventional wall slightly outperforms the thermal break shear wall with a rain screen for homes in Spokane. But despite that performance, the thermal break shear wall with and without the rain screen and the continuous wall insulation remain well within the acceptable moisture performance ranges. So in Spokane, to summarize, the double stud wall performs about exactly the same as a standard conventional wall. The thermal break shear wall, both with and without rain screen, and the continuous insulation on the exterior perform a little worse than a conventional wall, but again, well within the parameters that we would expect and well within the allowances. Now, I mentioned a few times this idea of a staggered stud wall as a variant of a double stud wall. This has a slightly different construction technique. In this case, instead of literally building two walls and keeping them an inch apart from each other, we're using a single sill plate and top plate. It could actually be double in terms of thickness, but I mean only one in terms of its width. And then we are staggering our 2x4 studs so that they are off center from each other. So again, we've reduced that thermal bridging throughout. We're able to use 2x4s instead of 2x6s because we've got plenty of studs in the wall. We still have a lot of room for insulation in here. We've seen this done with 2x4s on 2x6 plates. We've seen it done with 2x6s on 2x8 plates. There's a lot of different ways to do this. In fact, one interesting way that we saw was taking a standard 2x4 wall and nailing a 2x2 frame around it. If you look at the lower left-hand corner and you see that bright red, that's a 2x2 additional frame that was put onto a standard 2x4 or 2x6 wall to extend its width, and now we put our regular 2x4 or 2x6 studs on them in a staggered manner, and that can work the same as if you had done it with a single width plate. Some additional considerations to take into account. Again, how do you do your tie downs from one story to another? It can be unique and different with each of these walls. The thermal break shear wall in particular has some specific requirements to do those tie downs a little differently to ensure that you're not putting a strap over the foam, right? You need to get a tie down behind that. So that's worth considering. For the staggered stud wall that I just showed a minute ago, those walls are a lot heavier. So it may actually take an additional human to help tip that up. So while the framing can be pretty quick, you may need a little less wood than a traditional double wall. It is going to be a little bit heavier. So please do take into account as many of the holistic thoughts as go into this. Again, check out those reports for more information. And coming soon, we're actually developing some technical fact sheets that will soon be on the Better Built Northwest website, depending on when you're watching this. And these will do a short description, the benefits, the energy performance, the pricing, as well as some trades checklists for each of these different applications. So in other words, a short 5 to 7 page summary with graphics for each of the wall types to help support this type of training. So as we have all these discussions and think about these benefits of bringing the ducts inside or deeply buried, and we're penciling out how this is going to equate with the necessary credits, we recognize that there are, again, challenges here, right? What are my sequencing? Do I have to change distributors or trades? How many trades do I need to get involved to fix this? And end of the day, is there a big first cost associated with this? Well, what if I told you there was a way to help buy down some of this first cost? And there are a couple of different ways. One is taking advantage of utility incentives. Now, they're not universally the same everywhere, and not every utility has them. But if you work with a HERS rater, that is someone who is certified by ResNet as a home energy consultant, they can help you determine whether or not there is a local utility program that works well for you. In fact, you can go to our Better Built Northwest website, betterbuiltnw.com, and you can find a HERS rater that way. You can also find participating utility programs. On top of that, you can hire a HERS rater to help you look at the 45L tax credit, currently extended throughout 2021, but the new administration is looking at creating an enhanced version of it for 2022 and beyond. For the 45L tax credit, if you can show a 50% energy savings in the home you design and build today as compared to the 2006 IECC, you can get a $2,000 per home credit. Now that's pretty darn terrific, and think about that as a great way to buy down that first cost. Now it may require you to do a little bit above code, but the code in Washington State with that table 406.3 and all the additional credits required there, particularly for homes that when they do that also get to the ducts inside level, those types of homes typically don't need a lot of extra to qualify for the 45L tax credit. But engaging with the ResNet HERS rater is probably the best way to think about all the different mechanisms that can help you buy down these first costs, and they will become a valued trade ally as a part of your team. These third-party inspectors, not only can they help you with that cost, they can also really, be part of your quality mechanism. So there's been some research and some reports on, can we actually attribute some value to third-party inspections? So in a recent article on NAHB Now, they looked at a recent study from the SK Collaborative. So they looked at 10 recently constructed affordable housing projects in Georgia and looked at what the benefits were associated with third-party inspections on these homes. Part of what this analysis showed is that these HERS raters, not only did they help qualify for programs and tax credits, but they helped to identify a number of different deficiencies and failures uncovered during their inspection process. Some of these were installation failures. Even though there might have been, many code inspections, these are people who are trained specifically to look at, is the installation installed correctly? Will it perform as it's designed? Does it meet and exceed the manufacturer's specifications? They also found straight up building code failures that may have been overlooked by local code officials. This is not a knock on local code officials. Our code officials in general are pretty terrific, and it's a great business and career to have. But it's also incredibly challenging with continually escalating energy codes. So having a third-party person as part of your quality control team means that you're helping to find some of these either that got missed by an energy code inspector or before a code inspector actually does an inspection. The value there alone to help do things right the first time versus having to redo work almost pays for itself. As we get into the home stretch of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other things Better Built Northwest is doing to try to help make this process a little bit, feel a little bit easier or more attainable for you as a builder or as a home energy rater. One of the first things that we've done is we came out with a cost per credit calculator tool. So this does a bunch of different things for you. I don't expect you to read all of this. You'll have my contact information at the end. If you reach out to us either at info@betterbuiltnw.com or to my contact information, we can get you a copy of this calculator. So one of the things it does is on a very basic level, it allows you to select your 406.3 credits, and it'll tell you whether or not you're meeting your code minimums. But it can also do some things like give you some estimated costs associated with doing this. So let's take a little bit closer look at some of the components of the cost per credit calculator. So the first thing to note is that there actually is an instructions tab on this workbook, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but we always recommend you start there. The version 2.0 as of March 2021 is the most current version. There may be future versions that come out by the time you're watching this, but just know if you're looking at something earlier than version 2.0, it probably doesn't have the maximum amount of functionality. we do like to, or feel like we need to tell you that this tool is designed for education, consulting, and comparison purposes only. The prices that you're seeing here are not a decisive price list of every measure. They're very much so a series of averages. So depending on where you're building, the size that you're building, and how many homes that you're building, and the complexity of your homes, costs can be wildly different or only a little bit different. But it will give you a pretty good rough idea on the order of magnitude of costs for different measures. So as I mentioned, the primary goal here is a tool for comparing the different options in that section 406, those additional credits. So you can compare different example packages against one another, both in terms of different combinations, how many points are they worth or credits are they worth, what is the estimated incremental cost for different packages. So it really allows you to do some example packages. But we also built some additional things into it. We have a whole section in this calculator called the ease of implementation. And this takes into account, are there likely sequencing challenges or benefits associated with your selection? Could there be some material sourcing challenges? Are there any benefits to resiliency or durability or indoor air quality? Is there anything where there's something that we've learned is a traditional code challenge by one of the ways that you approach it? So it allows us to look at all of those things as additional criteria when we grade what might be the ideal selection for us. And then we provide a final score on a 1 to 10 scale that incorporates first cost plus this ease of implementation scoring mechanism into a single score. So it allows you to kind of look at different measures, trying to think of all of this at the same time. Again, our goal is not to tell you how to do it, it's to give you as many tools and options to make this as cost competitive for you as possible, and to help you think through that business case of what's the return on investment in both terms of time and money to go to code or to exceed code. One of the reasons that we do this is because we do want to continually provide better costs on average to the market. And this is important for a bunch of different reasons. For one, for utility incentive programs, for instance, when they determine what is the value of going above code by 6% or 12% or 18%, they have to look at from a cost effectiveness lens. In order to do that, it means we actually have to have pretty good costs. And as codes get developed, as the next 2 iterations of code are thought through, they also need to make sure that there are cost competitive ways to meet the code. So by providing tools like the cost per credit calculator and some direct consulting to the marketplace, our hope is that you, the builders, the trades, the raters, and consultants watching this presentation and using the cost per credit calculator tool may be willing to share some of your real costs back with us. Any costs shared back with us are completely anonymized. It will never say Jason from Bob's Construction said it cost this much, or Jennifer over at Custom USA said it would cost this much. It's anonymized, but it really does help us in that long run ensure that we do our best to try and keep utility incentives available and make sure that the next couple of iterations of code are as cost competitive as possible. So with all of this, I understand it's a lot, kind of like drinking from the fire hose whenever you sit through a Dan Wildenhouse presentation. So we don't expect you to have memorized everything you heard today, but I want to give you a couple of critical takeaways from today. First, when presented with code and it looks like the pain points are real and you're evaluating the challenges, don't forget to try to evaluate and monetize the benefits in order to truly create a business case of how far you'll go to meet or exceed code. That's number one. Number two, try to take advantage of people like home energy raters. Not only do they provide additional quality control on your projects, but they can also help you qualify for those tax credits, utility incentives, qualifying loan programs. What a great way to make sure that we buy down some of those first costs. Thirdly, there will be PDFs of these presentations that you can either reach out directly to me for or track them down on the betterbuiltnorthwest.betterbuiltnw.com website, so you can look at any of the live links that are in there. And finally, if you have questions and you want to talk any of this through, please reach out to me. Email is the best. It's on the screen right here. We're going to leave this up for a minute so you can jot it down. But of course, in the PDF, it will be available. And you can always just email info@betterbuiltnw.com. And that will also find its way to both myself and the rest of my terrific team. And we can figure out who best can help you think through all of these challenges. So with that, I want to say thank you very much for attending this version of Chasing Opportunities with the 2018 Washington State Energy Code. And we hope you'll sit through some of our other sessions and continue to go a little bit deeper each time. And remember, stay positive and think about this. These are opportunities at the same time they're challenges. So go forth and prosper. Thank you, everyone.